everyone. Here is a quick overview on IEPs and 504s. This information will be on the test, so it's important that you take good notes today. As always, anytime we're working in our notebooks, we want to make sure that we are adding that to our table of contents and then going to the next available page in your notebook and then titling that page as well. So your title for this one is simply IEPs and 504s, which I should now see reflected in both your table of contents and on that next available page. So our learning outcomes for this lesson, learning objective is that you'll be able to explain what an IEP and a 504 are. You should be able to compare and contrast the similarities and differences between them. And then, of course, define key vocabulary. So for our language objective, after listening to this presentation, you should be able to explain in writing in your notebook those differences and similarities. And then you should also be able to define key vocabulary. Our essential question for today is, what are the two laws that protect individuals with disabilities by ensuring that they receive a free and appropriate education? So if you are able to look back at these objectives at the end of the lesson and say, yep, I can do those things, and yep, I can answer this essential question, then you've met the goal of this lesson. So first, the two laws that are protecting individuals with disabilities and making sure that they receive what is called a free and appropriate education, otherwise known as FAPE, F-A-P-E. And the first one is commonly referred to as IDEA, and that is how I will refer to it in the classroom. But IDEA stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And essentially what that is it is one of the two laws that protects students who have disabilities to make sure that they are not discriminated against in the classroom. And keep in mind, as we talk about this, discrimination is not always intentional. Sometimes it is due to a lack of information or know-how to meet the needs of those students. But that is part of becoming a teacher, is learning how to meet those needs. The other one is the 504, which is actually just a section of a law. It's the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And again, this is a law that protects individuals with disabilities. This applies to education, applies to jobs. So I can't, as an employer, for instance, an employer cannot say that they will not hire someone based off of just that disability, right? This is the same thing that makes sure that we have wheelchair accessible facilities, that we have, all the things we're going to be talking about in this lesson, so that regardless of the type of disability that a student has, that we are able to meet their needs and still help them receive that high quality education that they deserve, just like their peers. So our key vocabulary for this lesson, we've got 7 that we need to document here. In your notebooks, you should write down the IDEA, and that it stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And then you should write down Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So going back to those two real quick, here we go. Whoops, excuse me, sorry about that. My mouse is not liking what I'm doing here. There we go. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And again, just briefly stating that that is something that protects individuals with disabilities and ensures that they receive a free, it should be fair as well, but a free and appropriate education. And then again, that's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Big hint, you need to know the year, okay? So again, our vocabulary. If you were in class on this day, we basically created a sticky note for each of these terms in our notebook. And we only had the term on the front side. And then that way, when you flipped up that sticky note in your notebook, you would see the definition written there. So this is just one format of taking notes that can be really effective for trying to memorize terms or vocabulary. That way you can kind of study alone and check yourself in a flashcard format without accidentally seeing the answer. So I'll go through some of these a little bit more in depth, but essentially an IEP stands for an individualized education plan. A 504 is a plan that originates from the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it's referring to Section 504. These are both legal documents, which is really important to understand about them, meaning teachers don't have the choice on whether or not they will follow an IEP or a 504. They are legally obligated. They are legally required to follow those documents. And then as students, if you have an IEP or a 504, it's important for you to know that those are your legal rights. So if your IEP states that you are supposed to receive certain services and you're not receiving those services, that would be a great opportunity to just have a conversation with that teacher to find out, whether that IEP was never received or perhaps it's an oversight. Like I said, I think it's important to remember and to assume good intent, that while we need to make sure these are being fulfilled and met, just because it might not be does not mean that there was some malicious or bad intention. It might have just been oversight, but that doesn't change the fact that it is a legal requirement. And so we need to make sure we're advocating for ourselves when necessary. The next one is RTI, which stands for Response to Intervention. Essentially, it is a tiered, meaning there's several layers to it. It's a tiered system that helps guide the intervention process for students who perhaps are struggling with learning, and so that we can identify the appropriate supports to put in place. Differentiation is a way of adjusting a lesson to meet the needs and or preferences of individual students. I really like to highlight that and or, because if you think back to all of those assessments we took, your multiple intelligences, your true colors that looked at your personality, your four tendencies that looked at, how do you respond to obligations that are, or expectations that are set for you? And then of course, love languages. How do you prefer to be treated, and that tells you that you're a valued individual. So if you think about those were all about preferences. They weren't necessarily your needs. So if I were to adjust my instruction to meet a student's preferred thinking preference, even though it's not a need and it's just a preference, that is still considered differentiation. So that's important to understand as we try to remember the small nuances and differences between some of these words. Scaffolding, you might have heard of this word in other industries such as construction. Regardless of what industry you hear it in, essentially it means supports of some kind. And so in education, scaffolding is a way of supporting students. And we'll get into some examples here in just a moment. Accommodations, they are now accommodation and modification. These two terms get mixed up very, very frequently by not just students, but new teachers as well. So accommodation is those specific scaffolds that we provide that help meet students' individual needs. It's kind of like making sure they're all learning the same thing, but how a student learns it might change based on that accommodation. Whereas a modification is adjusting the instruction or the lesson to meet the individual abilities of students, right? So modifying a lesson could actually change what the student is learning, not just how they're learning. So for example, I had a student who didn't just have a learning disability. She was actually at the developmental ability of a second grader in her emotions, socially, intellectually. She had the physical development of an 18-year-old senior, though. So for her, it wasn't just about giving her accommodations. It was actually about modifying the lesson, because due to her developmental ability, she was not at that same ability level as her same aged peers. And so I couldn't expect her to learn the exact same things. Whereas somebody who might be at the same developmental level as their same age peers, but perhaps they have a developmental delay or they have a learning difficulty or disability, that student might require some accommodations. They're still learning the same thing, but how they learn it might be a little different, okay? And again, we'll get into some examples here. So when we look at that individualized education plan, You see that one, there's eligibility. So students must be eligible to receive services indicated in an IEP or a 504. It's not just something that, parents say, hey, I think that my student might need this, or that the student says, hey, I kind of struggle with some focus. Can I get an IEP? It doesn't work that way. You have to be diagnosed or screened through educational screening tools to be identified as somebody who requires this extra level of intervention based on a diagnosed or identified physical or intellectual disability. This is all done and driven by data. So assessing the students, finding out what their strengths are, finding out what their areas of growth are, and then taking that down into their needs as a student, what they're currently able to do, and really where we want to get them going. And then when we get down to services and placement, that's finally when we are looking at the student is placed in the classroom and what accommodations and or modifications do we need to provide those students so that they have that equitable access to the lesson or the learning activity. So again, differences between the two. An IEP is looking at if a student has a learning disability and they need some accommodations or, again, possibly even modifications that adjust the curriculum or the instruction to meet their individual needs. A 504 is very similar. However, they are typically only accommodations. And we often see these more with like physical disabilities. Doesn't mean that it can't be there for an intellectual one. But for instance, if I have a student who has a hearing problem, then they might have a 504 that indicates that because they are hard of hearing in their right ear, they need to be facing their left ear toward the side of the room the teacher is typically delivering instruction from. RTI. So again, it's that tiered response. Again, everything in education, when we're looking at interventions or supporting our students, it's driven by data. If we don't have data that indicates, hey, the student needs some support, then we're just kind of, going at it blind in the dark. So we really want to make sure that we have data that's saying this is what the student needs. Differentiation. So again, when I am differentiating my instruction, it means just plain and simple that I am adjusting it to meet the individual needs or preferences of my students. If you were to do a quick Google search, just like this one, it would mostly come up as needs. But I think it's very important to understand that everything else we've been talking about in this unit has so far been more about preferences. And that doesn't make it any less of a differentiation just because it's not a quote unquote need. When we're looking at scaffolds, so again, like I said, it's essentially just an educational support. So ways of scaffolding writing, for example, if I tell the whole class that they're going to write 5 sentences about what they learned today, one way I could scaffold that for my students who require additional support, perhaps they have a disability, perhaps they're learning the language, then I might provide sentence frames instead. Today I learned blank. This was important because blank, right? That's a way to scaffold it. Giving, modeling, showing the writing process, providing word banks, things like that would really assist with students developing that writing. Now, something important to understand about scaffolding is that it's not necessarily just for students with disabilities. Scaffolding is something that you see in probably all of your classes. It's just different ways that we can kind of break out and guide students through a process until they're able to then do it on their own without any assistance. This image didn't come out as clear as I had hoped, but if we're looking at accommodations versus modifications. So again, this is the one that many individuals get confused. So an accommodation, like I said, it's more about the how. How is the student going to learn this? Are they looking at the same information as the rest of their peers, but this student perhaps has a seeing difficulty, a vision impairment, and so I provide them larger print? That would be an accommodation. If I were to do, one-to-one testing or maybe a small group testing, that would be an accommodation. Okay. But if I'm changing what the student is expected to learn, if I'm altering the curriculum, the lesson, the instruction, the demonstration of learning, any part of that, then that is actually a modification. Okay. So a student who might need lower level text, for example, perhaps I have a ninth grader, but they are reading at a fourth grade level, right? I can't expect them, no matter how many accommodations or scaffolds I give, that reading level alone is going to change what the student is able, what information they're able to take in, right? So that would actually be considered a modification. If I were to give them an alternate grading scale, or for example, I had a student that I had to change the entire curriculum in child development. They weren't able to learn everything that all the other students were doing. We had to really hone in on just some like practical can-do skills around working with babies, because the rest of the content just far surpassed that student's intellectual abilities. All right, so finally, in your notebook, these are the 10 things you should have. First, you should have what is IDEA? What does it stand for? What is a 504? That it comes from the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and that those two things are supporting or protecting individuals with disabilities to ensure that they are receiving a free and appropriate education. Okay, so those are two things. The next 7 things should be your vocab, right? So you should have IEP, 504, RTI, differentiation, scaffolding, accommodation, and modification. And then finally, this is the 10th thing that you are going to add. At the bottom of whatever page you're on, that you might have taken 2 pages to do these notes, you might have only taken 1. If you have room, or wherever you have room, you're going to create a Venn diagram, just a 2-circle Venn diagram, so that you can identify at least 3 things that IEPs and 504s have in common, and 3 things that are different about them. Okay. So first, because this is the most important, I want to make sure everybody has this. Right there in that center where the 2 circles overlap, I want you to write legal document. LEGAL, legal document. Both an IEP and a 504 are legal documents, and teachers are legally required to follow these documents. Okay. So I helped you with the first one. There's a scaffold for you. I would like you to come up with 2 more things that they have in common, and then 3 that are different about an IEP, and 3 that are different about a 504. And then you are done. So when you are finished with this, bring me your notebook, please, so that I can make sure that it gets marked off and you receive credit for these notes today. And this should be the last thing that you need before moving on to your personalized learning plan. So, of course, if you have any questions on that personalized learning plan, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you. Take care.